سمندر انت من للهدى مصدر وسيوطاتها هنا يا حيد إلك إيد تنجي الندى محتار.
Better than Imam Sadiq. And even though the Imam had many roles that he was playing, first of all, he assumed a leadership role. He had tens of thousands of followers during his time. And the Imam was a teacher. And the Imam was managing the affairs of the Muslims during his time. Despite all of that, the Imam was a abid. He worshipped Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala like no other human being would worship him.
Despite these words that were said by Malik ibn Anas, the founder of the Maliki school of thought, the Imam and his school of thought, the Jaʿfarī school, were never sanctioned by the authorities. In fact, the school was always attacked and was given the label of the Rāfidah, or the rejectors. As a result, the four Sunni schools of thought, the Maliki, Shafi'i, Hanbali and Hanafi, were supported and sanctioned directly by the authorities. However, the Jaʿfarī school was sidelined and attacked, but ultimately independent of any outsider influence. Among the most interesting of facts, however, was that the founders of all the other schools of thought received knowledge from Imam As-Sadiq, either directly or indirectly. Thus, by looking at the Jaʿfarī school of thought, one can see that it is the most unique school, as it was independent and the closest one to the teachings of the Holy Prophet Muhammad.
One of the most important points that we look at is what else makes it unique. If you notice, the other schools of thought, they actually take one school of thought over another based on the proximity to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this is a very good point, the chronological proximity, which means how far away were they from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. When we look at any famous people in the world and we want to write a biography about them, we look at the person who was nearest to them. So when we want to learn about Islam, this is one of the things that the Muslim scholars take into account, that what was the proximity of this person to Rasulullah from a chronological point of view. So they say, for example, Abu Hanifa was born 80 years after Hijrah and he died 150 years after Hijrah. So the proximity of Abu Hanifa is closer than any of the rest. And this is why the Hanafi school of thought is a school of thought that many of the Sunnis follow. The Malik bin Anas was born in 93 AH and he died in 179 AH. Ash-Shafi'i was born in 150 after Hijrah and he died in 204 after Hijrah. Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal was born in 164 and he died in 241. So obviously the nearest is Abu Hanifa. Now Imam Al-Sadiq alayhi salam was also born in 80 AH, slightly before Abu Hanifa. However, let's just say they were born at the same time. So when you look at who is most proximal to Rasulullah, we see Imam Al-Sadiq. The second thing that they look at is geographical proximity. That, for example, who was living amongst them. And the geographic proximity of Malik bin Anas was the closest, because Malik was somebody who lived in Medina. So we look and see that most of the North African nations, they took on the Maliki school of thought because of the fact that Malik bin Anas was a Madanite, and because he was living in Medina and he would have lived the life of the Sahaba and he would have spoken the language of the Sahaba, and therefore he would have achieved that cultural transmission of the religion, of the faith and the culture. And so in North Africa they said, look, we'll accept Malik as the Maliki school of thought as a main school of thought. The Hanafis, for example, because he was Iraqi, obviously the people of Iraq said, you know what, Abu Hanifa is a good example that we take the Hanafi school of thought. So when we look at Imam Al-Sadiq alayhi salam, Imam Al-Sadiq wins when it comes to chronological proximity. Imam Al-Sadiq alayhi salam wins when it comes to geographical proximity. He's from Medina, and Imam Al-Sadiq is on top when it comes to biological proximity, as we heard in the narration earlier with Abu Hanifa. This is the fourth and final major point where we look at and say that Imam Al-Sadiq alayhi salam's school of thought is the most unique. The fact that it was a school of thought based on revelation. That Imam Al-Sadiq salawatullah alayhi would say, hadithi, hadith abi wa hadith abi hadith jaddi, that my tradition is the tradition of my father, and the tradition of my father is the tradition of his father, my grandfather, and the tradition of my grandfather is the tradition of Ali ibn Abi Talib, and the tradition of Ali ibn Abi Talib. That's it. What more do you want? It's the tradition of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Even Imam Al-Sadiq, he says that our revelation comes to us elder upon elder, sends down that revelation. So here we have that, not only, again, we're talking about the proximal, geographical, chronological, biological transmission of the fiqh, of the jurisprudence, of the culture, comes into Imam Al-Sadiq sallallahu alayhi, is revealed into Imam Al-Sadiq, and he says we take it, he says, and we cover it. We protect it like people protect their gold and silver. This is the knowledge that we bring.
During the tenure as an Imam, the Imam would try to correct incorrect and contradicting beliefs. Amongst these beliefs was qiyas, which is known as injunction or analogy. Analogy involves an earlier decision being followed in a later case because the later case is similar to the earlier one. The Imam was extremely opposed to this belief. The reason behind this was that the use of qiyas can result in many incorrect jurisprudential laws being deduced, because no one solution can apply to different cases. Furthermore, when using qiyas, one will likely ignore the context of the ruling, which will again result in incorrect deduction. Being the founder of the Hanafi school of thought, Abu Hanifa used comparison as a source of legislation and jurisprudence. He used the method of deduction and applied it to Islamic jurisprudence, despite the multiple contradictions that this method usually results in. In a famous quote, Imam Al-Sadiq is mentioned to have said, "My father narrated from my great-great-great-great-grandfather, the Holy Prophet, who said, 'Those who act on the basis of analogy will face their destruction and lead others to their destruction. Those who give fatwas without the knowledge of the abrogating and the abrogated, the clear text and that which requires interpretation, they will face destruction and lead others to their destruction.'" As a result, the Imam had a well-known debate with Abu Hanifa on this issue, as he considered it to be one of the most dangerous ways of extracting legislation.
So one day, Abu Hanifa hears that Imam Al-Sadiq had arrived. So he went to see the Imam. Now remember that Abu Hanifa at this point was a little established. He had his own school, his own students. So he went to see the Imam at his residence. When he went, he asked for permission to enter the house and address the Imam. The Imam refused to give him permission. Now this is important because you have people out there who say that there was nothing but harmony between Imam Al-Sadiq and his quote-unquote student Abu Hanifa, but that could not be farther from the truth. Abu Hanifa asked for permission. The Imam refused to give him permission. So he stood outside for a while. Eventually there was a group of people who came. They asked for permission. They were granted permission. Abu Hanifa simply slipped, and he slipped himself into that group, and he went inside the house of Imam Al-Sadiq alayhi salam. When they sat down, Abu Hanifa said, "I have a question." The Imam said, "What's your question?" He said, "Why is it that your followers in Kufa curse the Khulafa? You have followers who profess a relationship with you and claim to be obedient to you, and they curse the Khulafa. Why don't you stop them?" Maybe one of the reasons that the Imam refused to give him permission, because he knew that he would do things like that. He would try and stir trouble. He would try and cause a controversy. As we've seen world over, individuals who aren't asking to learn, they ask questions just to cause a controversy, just to cause a stir, and just to stand out. So when he asked this question, the Imam said to him that I have ordered them, but they refuse to listen. أمرتهم ولكنهم لم يطيعوني. So the Imam told him that I have told my followers, but they refuse to listen. So then he insisted, Abu Hanifa insisted, that if they are truly your followers, then you're responsible for their actions. So listen to what the Imam told him. The Imam said to him, "First of all, I commanded you to stay outside, and yet you
disobeyed me and came inside along with this group. You disobeyed me right here, and you expect my followers to listen to what I have to say? If you have refused to accept and obey my simple instructions to stay outside, what else do you expect from people who live across the world or in a different country or a different city? That's one point. The second point is, don't you believe in analogy? He said, yes, I do. The Imam told him, how could you believe in analogy, in qiyas, when analogy goes against the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? He said, how so? The Imam told him, let me ask you some questions. Which is greater, meaning a greater crime? Killing someone, murder, or adultery? Abu Hanifa said, obviously, again, this is if you go with your own deductive analogy, if with your own mind, if you try to draw conclusions, you might say, well, it's obvious. Murder is worse than adultery. The Imam told him, if that is the case, why is it that to convict someone of murder, you need 2 witnesses, but to convict someone of adultery, you need 4 witnesses? To kill someone, فَكَأَنَّمَا قَتَلَ النَّاسَ جَمِيعًا, like you've killed everyone, and yet all you need to convict a murderer is 2 eyewitnesses. But for adultery, you need 4 of them to come and give testimony that they saw the act happening with their own eyes. Abu Hanifa was flabbergasted. He was dumbfounded. He had no answer.
Despite the discussions they had, Abu Hanifa continued to study under Imam Al-Sadiq for at least 2 years. Abu Hanifa went on to establish the Hanafi school of thought, which adheres in many things that Imam Al-Sadiq was against. Nonetheless, according to several narrations and records, Abu Hanifa used to say, without the 2 years Al-Numan would have perished. Apart from his debates with Abu Hanifa and the likes, the Imam was also debating many atheists and agnostics who tried to dissuade people from Islam and religion. During the time of Imam Al-Sadiq, the atheist and agnostic movement were growing rapidly due to the disenfranchisement and oppression that the people faced from the Caliphate, which was ruling the Muslim empire. When the people looked at the so-called Islamic Caliphate under the Umayyads and the Abbasids, they saw corruption, injustice,